Hello and welcome back to Projector at the London Film Festival. If you missed the previous episodes, be sure to catch up with them via the playlist. On this episode, Saoirse Ronan and Kate Winslet share a love on the rocks in the new film from the director of God's Own Country, Ammonite. Paleontologist Mary Anning, played by Kate Winslet, lives a solitary life searching for fossils on the beaches of Lyme Regis in Dorset that she can sell while taking care of her mother, Molly, played by Gemma Jones. When geologist Roderick Murchison, played by James McArdle, visits Mary's store while he's in Lyme, he leaves Mary to take care of his grieving wife Charlotte, played by Saoirse Ronan, while he goes on expedition. Although Mary at first bristles at Charlotte's presence, the two begin a relationship that slowly awakens into something far more intimate. Ammonite was the BFI London Film Festival's closing night film this year, and it's very loosely based on the life of 18th century paleontologist Mary Anning, who made significant finds and discoveries but was underappreciated in her own time, thanks largely to a male patriarchal scientific community that excluded women. So while Anning did get some limited recognition during her life, that's only grown in the years since her death, and we realise the sheer scope of what she managed to unearth. Ammonite does not claim to be a biopic, and the filmmakers have admitted as much. It's merely a fictionalised story that extrapolates from some of the facts that we do know about Anning's life, in particular that she had quite close relationships with several women. And even if you've not necessarily heard of Anning's name, you might still be familiar with her because allegedly she's the inspiration for the popular tongue twister "She sells seashells on the seashore." Ammonite is the second film from actor-turned-director Francis Lee, who made a fantastic directorial debut with 2017's God's Own Country, an extremely intimate gay love story set across the backdrop of the Yorkshire countryside. And that location work in particular really gave that movie a lot of its character. I think that the way that God's Own Country used the landscape in it almost gave it a kind of gothic, Wuthering Heights kind of quality, especially given the romance between the two leads and the way that kind of grows throughout the movie. It's something that's really kind of muddy and textured, but also incredibly beautiful at the same time, and certainly established Francis Lee as being a director with a very clear voice, and especially as one to look out for, and Ammonite continues in much the same vein. Ammonite was filmed in Lyme Regis in Dorset on the Jurassic Coast, on the very same beaches where Anning would search for her fossils, so immediately that gives the film a credibility and authenticity about it that is only amplified further by the way that Lee and his team have shot it, that emphasises the location's brutal beauty. Lee's filmmaking is very rugged and tactile and textured. You really get a sense of the place and its history, but also the movement and erosion there that's happening constantly. That was apparently quite a hurdle for the filmmakers because they would stage scenes to be shot the following day and then they'd come back and the landscape had completely changed on them. And that gives you an idea of just how dangerous it is there as well. You see this in one of the film's early scenes where Mary climbs up one of the cliffs facing the beach and it breaks away and she slides down it. In real life, Mary was very nearly killed by a landslide that claimed the life of her dog. So this is a really harsh, unforgiving landscape that's emphasised further by fantastic sound design in these sequences where you hear the waves crashing against the rocks and pebbles on the shore and the winds are whipping around you. It's a really, really tough environment that makes you feel cold and chilly, even just watching it. It's an environment and a job that would be enough to harden anyone, and that's precisely who Mary is. She may be weathered and resilient, but she's also jaded. It's a lifestyle and a passion that is very lonely and isolating, and while that's partly because she is separated from the scientific community and London feels like a long way away in Lyme Regis, it also feels like something that she's deliberately cultivated. She has built this shell around herself to prevent from being hurt again, and so she has cut herself off from everyone apart from the key essentials in her life, which is her work, her fossils, and taking care of her ailing mother. And so it's clear that there are some deep emotional wounds that have never really healed. And the film very heavily implies that a lot of that is because of some of her previous relationships with women. It's implied that she has had more than one relationship with women in the past, and especially with fellow geologist Elizabeth Philpott, who was another historical figure at the time, played in the film by Fiona Shaw. Shaw is great in this movie. She's only got very limited screen time, about 3 scenes, but she steals every single one of them, and she imbues that character with so much of the history that she has with Mary. You can sense it in those scenes, and they're so well played. Shaw and Winslet are really excellent together. And it's clear that whatever they had, it ended in this huge emotional fallout that has turned Mary into the person that we see at the beginning of the movie, who is simply just doing her work and nothing else. And Winslet is fantastic in this role. She's playing a character that doesn't have a lot of dialogue, especially because she's so closed off and brisk with other people. But even though Mary doesn't say a lot, you can see it very much expressed in Winslet's face. And it's a very subtle, nuanced performance where Winslet throws herself into the physicality of the part, and especially the way that Mary uses her hands and her body to scale the rocks and pull them out of the mud and break them apart, and all the things that come with geology in her line of work. And Winslet really does give you a sense of Mary as someone that has deliberately shunned society and its social ideals, especially with those regarding women. While I think the oppression of women during this time is not at the forefront of this movie explicitly, it always informs it implicitly all throughout, but it's perhaps more obviously seen in the character of Charlotte, played by Saoirse Ronan, who is at first perhaps even more quiet than Mary is, because in her very first scenes, Ronan says next to nothing. She stands around in the background of scenes looking pallid and restrained, and it's clear that the relationship that she has with her husband has deteriorated greatly, especially because he emotionally overrides her and doesn't know what to do with her. You see this in one of the early scenes where they're at a restaurant and he orders on her behalf and gets her a plain white fish, which is the embodiment of how dull and lifeless their marriage is. But also, it's clear that Charlotte is going through a great depression and grief. It's gradually eked out over the course of the first act that she has lost a child and is in deep melancholy. And so she is someone that has withdrawn within herself in a similar way to Mary, but not necessarily in the same way. And certainly it's a very different character than we've seen Ronan play. Ronan is such a lively performer and such an expressive one, so to see her like this is very unusual. Over the course of the film, that performance, of course, does gradually warm up, and again, as you would expect, Ronan is absolutely phenomenal here. She too is really, really great. And she plays off of Winslet so impeccably in the scenes that they have together, especially in those early scenes where the conflict between them is partially to do with class, in that obviously Charlotte comes from this very privileged background. She comes from London, whereas Mary is very much working class. But there's also the fact that Mary resents her presence there. She resents the fact that she essentially has to babysit Charlotte and take care of someone that she doesn't want to have that emotional burden in her life. But then, when Charlotte falls ill, they're in a situation where she's forced to take care of her, and there's a nice little shout out if you're a big fan of God's Own Country, where one of the leads of that movie, Alexandru, actually comes back in a supporting role playing the Doctor. And once Mary has to take care of Charlotte's health, that proves to be the crucial turning point in their relationship, in that Mary shows this caring, compassionate side that previously she was too guarded to reveal, and Charlotte responds to that tenderness with a growing respect and admiration for Mary, and especially for her work. She appreciates just how difficult it is, but also it's brilliant in a way that few have recognised in this time, and even to the surprise of Mary herself, who is somewhat cynical about it, but Charlotte encourages Mary to know her own worth. And one of the pleasures of the film, like in God's Own Country, is seeing the characters and the performers warm up. And I do think that's aided by Lee's filming style, because he prefers to shoot his movies in chronological order, and I think that helps with the actors' progression across the running time and the way those characters change all across it. I think that there is a big arc, especially for Ronan Charlotte, that can be plainly seen on screen, but also the way those characters gradually become more vulnerable and more intimate. One of the major features of God's Own Country was the sex scenes, which were one of the rare examples, I would say, where there was real storytelling in them. They weren't gratuitous. They were key to understanding the characters and their psychology and their attitudes towards relationships and the way those change over those sequences. And to some extent, the same is true in Ammonite, in that the sex scenes are really unguarded and surprisingly explicit, but also it does, I think, show the way the characters really open up to each other. And I think that that makes those scenes not really gratuitous, in spite of the fact that they are quite lengthy in this movie. However, that also touches upon the problems that I had with Ammonite, in that I don't think it has the same spark as God's Own Country did. And I found this to be a really hard thing to try and quantify, because in many ways, the two films operate very similarly, but there's something missing in Ammonite, and I can't quite pinpoint it. I do think part of it is the opening of the movie. Lee is a very slow, very deliberate filmmaker, especially in regards with his pacing, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. This is a movie that asks for a lot of patience from its audience as it gradually draws out those characters. The issue I have, though, is that the way that they start this movie, they're so withdrawn, it gives you very little to actually connect and engage with, and I found myself really struggling to fully immerse myself into the movie. I did find my attention wandering somewhat because I couldn't establish that at the beginning of it. I felt that later on, once those characters became more expressive and became more open, I felt like the movie found its footing more and I engaged with the material better. But I think perhaps the reason why the movie doesn't quite work is the relationship between Ronan and Winslet on screen and their chemistry. I think that individually, they're both fantastic, but I think together, it's only sporadically do they truly nail the material in the way I think they should. And I don't think this is a problem with the acting or the directing. I just think they're not quite on the same level as Josh O'Connor and Alex Sandru in God's Own Country. And sometimes that just happens. Sometimes you can get great actors and you think they'll work together beautifully, and they just don't have that alchemy. And that feels like the case here. It should work, but it kinda doesn't. What I will say in the movie's defense is that given the way the relationship plays out, especially towards the ending, the fact that the two characters and their respective performances may not necessarily be on the same page may well have been a deliberate choice on the part of the actors and the director, but that still doesn't explain why there's a strange lack of passion even in the most erotic moments. Ammonite remains doggedly cold to the touch throughout, and that is a bit of a pity because I think that Lee is a very talented, very intelligent director, and you can see this all throughout. This is a movie that is filled with research and details and nuances, and I perhaps think that Ammonite may well improve on a repeat viewing, where I have a better sense of where it's going, and I can appreciate all those little intricacies. I can appreciate that Lee is a very delicate filmmaker in that way. I just think that what he's made is a movie that stimulates the audience mentally, but not emotionally. I don't think that Ammonite is on the same level as God's Own Country, but that's a really tall ask to make. God's Own Country was so authentic and rough and surprising, and if you like that movie and Francis Lee's work, you should probably go and see Ammonite anyway, because in many ways, it does feel like a spiritual sequel, and certainly continues with the same kind of tone and mindset, and you may well appreciate it more than I did. I've also seen a number of people comparing it to Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which I do think that Ammonite is a little bit unfortunate following in the wake of, but I haven't seen that movie, so I can't make that point of comparison for myself. What I will say about Ammonite is that it's a very respectable movie, and there are plenty of things that work about it, especially those two performances from Winslet and Ronan, who individually are really fantastic, and Lee knows how to use the photography and the landscapes of Lyme Regis, and they're really brilliant in this film. Unfortunately, it's a movie where all the right elements are there, but it just didn't quite come together for me. And sometimes that's just what happens. Sometimes you just don't get that magic. And I don't hold it against any of the filmmakers or the talent involved, to be honest. Sometimes that's just the way that it breaks down. I do think, though, it's a movie that I wanted to love more than I really did. It's just too chilly for me. If you like this review and you want to support my work, then you can do so by unearthing my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.